let's see here. Let's flip here. I'm the Director of Advisory Innovations here at Trusted Sec. I've been in information security probably way too long, but today I want to talk a little bit about calculating and measuring business impact. I'm going to start relatively at a high level, just to kind of give a little bit of perspective as to how I kind of look at business impact. There are a number of challenges associated with business impact. First and foremost, security programs. Security programs are generally, the growth and maturity of a security program typically follows in what I consider the wake of the actual growth of a business, right? And the organic nature, the organic growth, naturally results in kind of a reactive program generally for many years. So one of the challenges is, as we improve our controls and improve our security posture and programs, we need to effectively kind of overcome this, what I call this virtual brick wall, and really begin to look at it from the perspective of aligning security more with the business itself, right? Organically grown programs tend to stack their lineups, with heavy hitting controls like multi-factor authentication, EDRs, remote access VPNs, which obviously are necessary components, to a security program itself. But in order to really better align, the protection of business critical data for any organization, we really need to look at, how our work in information security affects the business, and business impact itself is, one of those big variables here. So from a foundational perspective, I look at a security strategy, from the perspective of these three primary buckets, right? We have maturity, program maturity, which is, pretty straightforward. I'll get into some details of each of these in a second. So program maturity, and then organizational effectiveness, right? Which is really all about measuring kind of our current capabilities. So if we have a number of things that within our security program from a maturity perspective, it's also super important to kind of measure how capable those tools are and those capabilities, just in terms of, whatever the specific roles are, if it's a detective tool or protective tool, things of that nature. And then the third bucket, again, at this very high level, security strategy is all about business risk, right? What's the likelihood of bad things happening? And if they were to happen, what would be the financial ramifications? And that second half is really all about what this business impact talk, is really about, right? Program maturity, pretty straightforward, right? All about governance, policy standards, data classification, which we're going to get into quite a bit here. Data classification. I recently did a couple of blogs on data classification and system classification, but it tends to be an overlooked kind of program maturity component. Similarly, inventory management, also a very, very crucial component of calculating and measuring business impact. We can go down the list, but I'm just going to, basically move on. I do want to now let's talk about, effectiveness, organizational effectiveness, kind of second bucket here. So if effective is defined as achieving a desired outcome, effectiveness then becomes the measurement of achieving our desired outcome. And for most people who would be tuning into a webinar like this, our kind of collective desired outcome generally is, well, cool, the tools in our environment detect and prevent attack techniques that potentially could lead to breaches of our systems. So when we look at organizational effectiveness, again, really all about measuring capabilities, right? Compliance, services, audit, audit and evidence collection measuring how effective an organization is with, let's say, complying to different, regulatory frameworks. We offer what's called our attack path effectiveness, very much about measuring how effectively the tools in an organization have been deployed and how well they should be able to detect attack techniques. Lots of technical testing solutions are really kind of falling into this effectiveness bucket. The red team, blue team, purple team, defensive validation, all really kind of measuring how effective an organization's controls are when, facing specific attack techniques and things of that nature. Even phishing testing, right? Testing how effective our security awareness training is. Incident response tabletops, testing how effective our incident response standards are, et cetera, et cetera. And then the last third, high level bucket here is obviously then business risk services. We have risk assessment, we have impact analysis, which is going to be, the primary focus of this particular webinar. But especially when we look at risk itself, it really falls down into two primary variables, right? We have on the first, on our y-axis here, probable loss magnitude, which is ultimately our impact. And then our x-axis here, loss event frequency, which ultimately is our likelihood, right? So risk is all about determining what's the likelihood of bad things happening. And then if they were to happen, what would be the expected impact to the organization, right? So impact, let's talk impact. When I look at impact analysis, I really look at it from the perspective of, here's a goal. We really want to be able to fully document and understand the expected impact of unexpected things happening to the organization that results, in business systems and sensitive data potentially being breached or even becoming unavailable, right? Ransomware is a great example of that availability hit. And can be very, 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 very impactful for organizations that succumb to a successful ransomware attack. However, achieving that goal ultimately is fairly challenging for most organizations for a number of reasons. Siloing within an organization, right? You have many larger organizations, different teams have a tendency not to talk to each other in terms of, even within the technical fields, but let alone technical silos, not necessarily always communicating with other areas of the business, be it finance, be it HR, things of that nature. I mentioned another one earlier, the lack of data classification. Like I said, early data classification tends to be a second thought for most organizations who are, on the journey of organically growing their security program. And it really doesn't, in my opinion and my experience, it really doesn't become a major player in a security program until the organization really begins to understand that we need to align security much better with the business itself, right? So now we have to really kind of define data classification and then apply that to, critical systems, right? Which all of this, I'll be diving into in a little bit more detail. Undefined critical systems, right? The lack of really kind of the understanding of what are the systems that keeps our organization afloat. Incomplete inventories is also another big challenge. And then last but not least, unmapped supporting critical system assets, right? We have to understand if we're looking at larger scale systems, that are critical for an organization's business, success, we also have to have an understanding of, well, what are those supporting assets beneath it that, that we also need to be very, very cognizant about in terms of, let's say, vulnerabilities or even restoration of down systems, things of that nature. So when I look at measuring impact, from my perspective, the process really kind of boils down to this, right? We need to document and define what our actual high-level critical systems are. But also, when we look at it from a financial perspective, we also have to really kind of define what our worst-case scenarios are, right? A 4-week ransomware outage is, a pretty good, I would say, test case for kind of defining what a worst-case scenario could look like. Obviously, there are certainly other examples of that. So defining that worst case scenario, we also need to estimate the expected financial losses for our business functions, right? And there are multiple business functions within an organization. You can take a look at things like customer service or product development, things of that nature. Additionally, we have to, really estimate expected losses related to regulatory and contractual obligations, right? So if our systems are down and we have contractual obligations or even compliance obligations, that are relying upon these systems that are now down, that's also potentially a financial hit to any organization. And last but not least, mapping then our critical systems to actually what those supporting assets are. So, now we really kind of have to look at, all right, well, what from a foundational perspective in our actual security program, what do we really need to do? And I look at this from the perspective of these four things here, right? So business systems analysis is ultimately sitting down with an organization and sitting down with different aspects, different areas of an organization to really understand, what the critical systems are, right? And I'll dive into that in a second and in a little bit more detail. And then, data and system classification, inventory management, and inventory management is a big can of worms for many organizations. It just, the reality is that, it's very, very difficult to completely secure, your environment if you don't know exactly what is in your environment. And knowing what is in your environment tends to be a big challenge for many organizations. And lastly, just understanding impact as it relates to those different business functions. So, business systems analysis, our first bullet point here. That's kind of, in my experience, kind of separated down into multiple different areas, right? Financial business impact is really, in my opinion, the first step, right? Really sitting down with financial leadership of any organization and asking the question, which is, okay, at what level of a financial hit would fundamentally alter the way you do business today, right? So for example, can a $500 million organization survive a $50 million financial loss? Some may be able to do that. Some may not be able to do that. That's very, very subjective just from the perspective of, the business, the industry, how it's run, the leadership teams, et cetera. And then understanding to what degree, has the organization modeled actual loss, scenarios, right? If you're in manufacturing, if you have, let's say, 20 different plants in your organization, if one of those plants goes down for 2 weeks, how much revenue would the organization expect to lose, because that specific plant is currently unavailable and not able to actually produce anything. So on the financial side, those are kind of the things that I tend to gravitate towards and have conversations around with financial leadership. There's a little bit of a side note here, and folks who are in kind of like the risk, the risk areas of information security will, the conversations always, kind of generate around the conversation of, what's better, qualitative, semi-quantitative, or full quantitative risk assessment. But ultimately, we're at this point just talking about impact, that x-axis, and not necessarily the likelihood aspect of this. We still, in business impact analysis, need to understand how are we going to be essentially, looking at the financial loss. Are we looking at it from a qualitative perspective, a quantitative perspective, or some hybrid in between? The typical answer, the typical consulting answer to this particular, conversation is, well, it depends. It depends on the business. It depends on, again, leadership and how they run their organization, things of that nature. The next step and component of business systems analysis is really looking at it from the perspective of what are our actual most important, systems to our business. And this is where I really stress, the importance of talking across and throughout the organization, because ultimately, people who run a particular, let's say, small bubble within a larger organization have a tendency, and this is more of a human trait than anything else, but have a tendency to believe that their little bubble within that business is the most important little bubble in that business, right? So everybody believes that their systems, or the systems that support, their operations or their finance teams and things of that nature are ultimately the most important systems in that organization. So it's very important to have conversations across a number of different business units or lines of business, however the organization is kind of organized, right? It's really necessary then to, ensure that leadership support is in place for these types of conversations, right? Because people are busy, and these types of assessments, can take a little bit of time here and there. But chatting with line of business leadership to really discuss, for example, what are your top 5 critical systems, right, that are necessary for the success of your team, and doing that across the entire organization, or at least the major, lines of business or business units, really gets us closer to a more holistic kind of a holistic look at what are the actual full most critical systems within any organization. And then contingency planning conversations also, right? If these systems are unavailable, do you have contingency plans, and things of that nature? For example, could you, if let's say your payroll system is unavailable, can you kind of drop back and write, actual checks to pay people? How long can we do that? Those are some really interesting, conversation starters for this type of conversation within the business systems analysis. And then lastly, functional business impact, right? This is where I kind of mentioned earlier, right? There are different kind of functions within any organization. And so, if some of these critical systems are actually unavailable, what potential financial impact would that have on these specific areas, right? So some examples here include customer service. I mentioned production quality, service delivery. All of these are different areas of an organization's kind of revenue centers and cost or profit centers. So based on our expected losses, based on kind of our defined critical systems, if those systems become unavailable, now what's that effect on these different areas of an organization? Some other things to consider, right? Would the organization incur fines from, contractual obligations, and even things like employee retention, right? I mentioned, if there is a disruption in payroll, would that ultimately, an extended disruption in that system, result in employee retention issues? Having a pulse on the organization's cash flow is critical to any business. And so breaking it down into like these supporting profit centers to help prioritize what our critical systems are, is really kind of the goal of this first phase of the business impact analysis. Next, data classification, right? Like I mentioned earlier, data classification typically takes a back seat, right, to some of the large scale controls like multi-factor authentication, backup systems, VPNs and remote access, et cetera. I did, as I mentioned, I recently posted a couple of blogs on the TrustedSec website related to data and system classification. The high level summaries are really, defining your data classification standard, applying data classification then to the organization's defined critical systems that came from our business systems analysis, and ensuring that ensuring we have complete inventories. Again, a big challenge for many organizations. Mapping each critical system to their supporting assets, right? So now, once we have solid, complete inventories, what are the actual supporting servers and applications and things of that nature that basically, comprise a particular critical system. And then applying that type of system classification across different domains within a security program, like incident response, vulnerability management. Prioritization is really one of the one of the values that comes out of, a solid business impact analysis. So right, data classification at the highest level, it's pretty straightforward, right? We need to kind of define the types of data that the organization handles. And it can be very, very simple, right? We can have, in this example, right, confidential is defined as data with restricted access, sensitive in nature, need to know basis, right? Internal data could be defined as data restricted to personnel with legitimate business purpose, and then public data, well, there's no restrictions on that type of data, right? So ultimately your data classification standard and / policy can be very straightforward, simple and straightforward. Now there are certainly ancillary, kind of components to data classification. We can also talk about things around, data retention, data restriction, what are our criteria for encrypting certain types of data. But at the very high level, data classification is pretty straightforward, right? Now, what we really need to do is take that and apply that to system classification, right? So generically, and I talk about a little bit of, in this image, you can see a ringed kind of system classification example. But, ultimately, these types of, the system classification is really related to data classification because certain systems may touch confidential information. Certain systems may touch internal, business data and things of that nature. So we need to treat them differently. Now, where we start kind of branching off into, or maybe a little bit away from the defined data classification standards and into system classification, this is where we can really begin saying, okay, well, these core systems like our Active Directory, our operational technology networks, things of that nature, our infrastructure even, then we're going to call that our ring zero most critical type systems. And then kind of as we move outward, systems that rely on that first ring zero, such as ERPs and medical record systems, industrial control solutions, things of that nature. Maybe that's our ring zero, our ring one, classification systems, and out and onward, right? So being able to effectively take our data classification and apply it in a way that makes the most sense for your specific organization into a system classification, framework, so to speak. Next, inventory management, right? Like I said, you can't secure what you don't know really exists in your environment. The importance of accurate inventories, is obviously a very, very crucial component to a security program, right? We need to know, and we need to be able to map these types of, assets that are in our system, that are in our ecosystem, our environment, to those larger business critical systems, right? And there are certainly barriers to that. And I kind of touched upon a couple of them earlier, but there's all generally in many, organizations that have operational technologies, a lot of times the IT teams don't manage the OT environments, and that could be a very big blind spot for the IT teams and have very little visibility into the inventory management of that, type of network. Similarly, inventory systems, you may have strong Windows-based or inventory systems that are focused on Windows systems, but not so much on Linux and things of that nature, and even disparate inventory sources, right? Everything from patching systems to vulnerability scanners that can contribute to to an organization's complete inventory management process, basically. And then the next step is really okay, let's map all of these things that support it, right? Mapping high-level critical systems to their supporting assets in our inventories. Once we can accomplish that, we have a solid understanding of, not realistically, organizational loss thresholds, right? our most critical systems are mapped to our data classification, levels and things of that nature, and expected financial loss. We've now had these conversations if these systems fail, right? So, that's really kind of the goal for all of this is getting to the point where, our security program, looking at it, from a business impact perspective, we have our defined organizational loss thresholds that come from conversations with financial leadership. The most critical systems in our environment are mapped to data classification levels and system classification as well. Expected financial loss is now something that we have a pretty solid handle on in terms of what should we expect from a financial loss should these systems fail, and then which underlying assets across the organization actually support those higher level business critical systems. At that point, or at this point, so we can really begin to now apply business impact analysis across different domains of our security program. And so when we look at the application of business impact analysis, first and foremost, risk, right? So risk assessment and risk analysis. What we've just kind of walked through here from an impact analysis, again, is one of the two primary variables of risk assessment, right? The likelihood of, bad things happening, and then if those bad things happen, what's the potential impact? Well, excellent. We now have a very good handle on that impact analysis and what to potentially expect if some of these systems are either breached or are unavailable. Now we can look at it from a likelihood perspective. We have these types of controls in place that should lower the likelihood of those bad things happening that would result in, financial impacts that we've derived here. Vulnerability management. Most vulnerability management platforms today have the ability to kind of weight, there's the assets that are, within its kind of domain. So going back to that ringed system classification example, for example, Active Directory, you would probably want to weight that higher than you would like a standard, let's say, printer or laptop. As the vulnerability scanners then go out, do their thing, and come back with vulnerability scanning results of known bugs in applications that potentially could be exploited. The vulnerabilities that are applicable to your higher or more critical systems are going to be rising to the top, so to speak. So from a prioritization perspective, we are targeting in and prioritizing mitigating vulnerabilities that are affecting our most critical systems. Incident response, especially from a recovery perspective, right? Once an organization has gone through and kind of, discovered what's happening in the environment from an incident perspective, contained that, removed, figured out, how everything happened and, how the potential or how the attackers got into the environment. Once the incident response process moves into recovery, our impact analysis now gives an organization the ability to prioritize recovery operations, right? We need these systems because they're crucial to our business recovered first, right? So, being able to prioritize recovery operations is another application of business impact analysis. Adversary simulation, actually targeting an organization's business critical systems, provides a lot of value when we're looking at it from the perspective of, advanced adversaries, utilizing advanced techniques to potentially get into an organization and either breach and steal intellectual property or, PII and things of that nature, whatever that particular whatever those actors' motivating factors are from a breach perspective. The adversary simulation gives us the ability to prioritize systems that actually handle our crown jewels. And then disaster recovery, exercises, there really should be defined playbooks that ensure that, in disaster recovery, if we're moving from, let's say, data center A to data center B because of whatever reasons, whether it's testing or whether there's an actual potential outage, on the primary data center, ensuring that those playbooks exist to make, our most critical systems for our business operations fully functional before other less critical systems. So that's really, from the perspective of, this impact analysis, this webinar and impact analysis. That's, the content that I wanted to kind of walk through. Just to kind of wrap it up, again, there is kind of an order of operations. It's not necessarily set in stone. Your mileage may vary. But, you defining and deploying that data classification standard, defining organizational loss thresholds, defining organizations' critical systems, estimating how a breach or the unavailability of these types of critical systems would affect different business functions, right? Again, like customer service or operations, production support, et cetera. Inventory management, we need to, it's absolutely necessary to have solid inventory management to effectively, calculate business impact. And then from those inventories, from those solid inventories, mapping those supporting assets to the critical systems themselves, and apply liberally across all the different types of domains within your program. At the end of the day, the ability to measure business impact brings us that much closer in aligning what we do on the security side with, the business itself. And ultimately, that's one of the most critical and challenging aspects of any security program, because, when you look at who needs to be making decisions for the business, they generally don't speak the same language as the security and technical teams, and vice versa, right? So being able to actually kind of go walk through a process like this to understand financial impact, that's really the language that leadership teams in any business speak. And this brings us that much closer to being able to better align, the information security components of an organization with the business components of the organization. And from my perspective, that's the ultimate goal. So, Patrick, I would, thanks everybody for kind of tuning in. I hope this was valuable. I'm not sure. I wasn't really paying attention. Do we have any questions or anything like that? Not so much.
No questions that have come through the chat. So if there are no other additional questions, then we'd like to thank everybody for joining us today.